I'm going to get us started. Again, welcome everybody. Wherever you're coming in from, we're delighted to have you join us for the first of our workshop events this semester at the Hard Histories Lab at Johns Hopkins. I'm Martha Jones. I'm the director of the lab. Across the table from me is Lauren Feldman, our program coordinator, and I'm about to introduce our guest. But I urge everybody to get ready with your questions and comments. For Dr. Rubin, we'll use the raise hand function. And so you can weigh in at any time, and I will keep the queue and unmute you. That's the word I'm looking for, unmute you, so that you can ask your question. I'm thrilled to have you here, Dr. Rubin. I was saying before we went live that I never forgot my visit with you to what was the Imaging Research Center at UMBC. It was the first time I'd ever experienced virtual reality and visited a virtual cafeteria and had lunch, but I was still hungry. But you really opened up for me a window onto the extraordinary possibilities for us as digital humanists and the ways in which your collaborations are bringing you into partnerships with departments and fields and schools way beyond history departments. And that to me was really an eye-opener. So let me formally introduce you before I turn things over. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Anne Sarah Rubin to Johns Hopkins in the Hard Histories Lab. She's a professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and so one of our much beloved and admired sister departments, where she teaches courses on the Civil War, the American South, and the 19th century United States. She was, as I mentioned, the Associate Director of the Imaging Research Center at UMBC from 2017 to 2020, and the Lipitz Professor of the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences from 2016 to 2017. Professor Rubin's most recent book is The Perfect Soul, a soldier's memoir of the Great March to the Sea and the Campaign of the Carolinas, an edited volume. In 2014, she published Through the Heart of Dixie, Sherman's March in American Memory, which was a study of the significance of Sherman's March in American culture. True to her deep identity as a digital humanist, that book was accompanied by an online exploration of Sherman's March, which you can find. I don't always read URLs in introductions, but it's an easy one and it's worth remembering because it's fascinating. www.shermansmarch.org. She's also the author of the award-winning A Shattered Nation, The Rise and Fall of the Confederacy, 1861 to 1868. And her current research, which I hope someone will ask her about, and if you don't, I will, centers on food and famine in the Civil War South. Professor Rubin is currently an OAH, that's the Organization of American Historians, Distinguished Lecturer. She's currently the Vice President of the Southern Association for Women's Historians and was President of the Society of Civil War Historians from 2012 to 2014. Today, she's going to be speaking to us out of another of her extraordinarily ambitious and ongoing, long-standing projects, Slave Streets, Free Streets, which is a close look at early Baltimore from the ground up through the possibilities of a digital inquiry. We were treated to, hot off the presses, your article from Current Research in Digital History. And I think everybody who registered for the event has gotten a copy of that. And so some of our questions will emanate from that. Again, I want to say thank you very much for being with us. Thanks for coming out and being with us in person. And we welcome everybody out there who's with us. But let me turn it over to you and ask you to just introduce the discussion in any way you'd like.
Thank you so much, Martha, and thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you also, Lauren Feldman, for handling the logistics. I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see if that works, hopefully. Yes, I'm allowing you. I should have practiced this before, because now they're saying yes, do it. Whatever, share everything. Okay. See if this will work. If not, I'll ask someone else to share it. But all right, I think we're in business. Yay. Wonderful. So this, first of all, I guess also just before I get started, I also wanted to say this is a project that actually does have some Johns Hopkins connections. So it's very nice to be here. Over the years of working on this project with the Imaging Research Center and my collaborator, Dan Bailey, we met with Lawrence Jackson, who's in the English and History departments and has a great map of Frederick Douglass's Baltimore. We met with Jim Gillespie from the library, who does a lot of GIS work and has helped us with mapping. And a couple of years ago, actually, Julie Rose at Homewood invited me to give a talk about the project. And also I got a really lovely tour of everything that's been going on there. So I feel very, very happy to be here and be sharing my work today. Before we really dig into the nitty-gritty of the project, I thought I'd give you a little bit of an overview and explain how this came about, how someone who is certainly by my publications pretty clearly a Civil War historian is working on early Baltimore. The IRC began this project, which overall we call it Visualizing Early Baltimore, and it's got a big map called the Bearings of Baltimore, and then Slave Streets, Free Streets, and then a smaller one-off that was done for Baltimore Gas and Electric, actually. But the IRC started this project in conjunction with the Maryland Center for History and Culture, formerly the Maryland Historical Society. In 2012, it was intended as for the bicentennial of the Star-Spangled Banner. And that actually explains why the bird's eye view is at a little bit of a funny angle, because we had to get Fort McHenry in, and I'll just zoom in and you can see how beautiful the fort looks, even on, my screen. What the IRC staff did between 2012 and 2014 was they did pretty deep historical research, and they combined that with modeling and mapping technologies to create an accurate 3D model of the city of Baltimore, of its terrain, its land use, and the buildings in circa 1815, so in the era of the Star-Spangled Banner. And you can also see, you can toggle it to view 2016. I like to show this to students because you see how much of Baltimore is landfill, quite a lot, and also it helps people get situated. IRC programs made the scene navigable online. It's also navigable by touch screen, so you can zoom in, and let me just do that a little bit more. Oops, I'll just zoom into a place, that's easier. So here's the Indian Queen Hotel, just so that you get a sense of the texture. So the topography is accurate. The buildings are placed where we knew buildings existed. If it's a building that still exists, it's an actual model of the existing building or how it would have been at the time. Otherwise, researchers drew on drawings and plans, just all the kinds of deep work that you need to do to make these kinds of models with textures, and the ground is all painted. The reason that I'm able to zoom in like this is because the image itself is 2.5 billion pixels, which that's a lot. Let's leave it at that, to give you this bird's eye view. And then running along the base are hotspots, which have information and documents from the Maryland Center. So for example, let's see what pops up. Oh, whoops. You would think I knew how to work my own machine. There we go. So this gives you a little bit of more information on that. Over the past several years now, my colleague Dan Bailey has gone deep into GIS and has actually redone the base map by georectifying dozens of different maps of Baltimore, and I can talk more about that if someone's interested, although my actual GIS knowledge is somewhat limited. But so to make the topography even more accurate, and actually he's even tracked now the bathymetry of the harbor. And in fact, our staff at the IRC are working now to rebuild the map so that this newer, more accurate topography is reflected. Also, there's about 3,000 buildings in here, which means that every once in a while somebody looks at the map and says, oh, you're missing my house from 1802. And so we've gradually been adding in new buildings to make the map more accurate and more usable. So I had been working with the IRC on another digital project in 2014 on my Sherman's March project. And I was there one day for a meeting, I don't know, probably this summer, and Dan said, oh, we should really show you this project we're working on with Maryland Historical Society. And they showed it to me, and of course, you know, my head sort of exploded with how incredible it was and how beautiful it was and how detailed it was. And then I turned to him and I said, I can't believe you haven't called me about this. And you need an actual historian. So they worked a lot with architectural historians. But if you notice, these streets are beautiful, but there are no people on them. And so I said, you need me to work on this and to help you start actually telling the story of this place and putting people on. And the analogy that Dan and I like to use is that they've built an incredible stage set, and now it's time to use the stage set. And my thinking of how to do this was really influenced by the work of historians that, if you know anything about Baltimore, you know a lot about them, particularly Seth Rockman's incredible book, Scraping By. And we actually have, if you've read Scraping By, everybody loves the mud machine. And so we have actually built a model. There is an actual model of the mud machine. And the best part of it is the woman who was doing this had been trained as a patent lawyer. And so she pulled the patents in order to make the model. She was so meticulous. But anyway, so my thinking was really influenced by Seth Rockman's work, by Christopher Phillips' incredible book, Freedom's Port, and by this idea that rather than use this map to tell the story of the elite of Baltimore, to talk about the Carrolls and the Ridgeleys and people whose stories we knew really well, this was an opportunity for us to talk about the ordinary people of Baltimore, the working class of Baltimore. And in particular, to focus on the lives of Baltimore's African Americans, because Baltimore is such an unusual place in the early 19th century, where there's a population of over 10,000 free African Americans and a little over 4,000 enslaved workers. And it's unusual for there to be a city in the slave-holding South with a large free Black population, larger than the enslaved population, and a population, those two populations are very deeply interwoven and interconnected. So that is what we wound up doing. And we went through a bunch of different ideas of stories to tell and different iterations as we applied multiple times for grant funding, which we never got because it's really hard to get. But all of them, what these different iterations had in common was this focus on the lives of ordinary people, a kind of bottom-up history. And the project that I've written about in the articles that you got for today, Slave Streets, Free Streets, was our last prototype that we had submitted in the summer of 2019. And the images in those articles are from the prototype design document that we had submitted. So I will really stop there and I can open it up. I'm really interested to hear what questions people have about the project.
Terrific. Thank you. I think we're going to invite you to stop sharing.
Okay.
And then I think folks will be able to see us as we talk. And I'm going to get us started because I think that one of the questions I had is someone who also has worked on Baltimore and thought a lot about it, and made the case for why Baltimore. My sense is that over the life of this project, maybe a broader understanding of how and why Baltimore fits is in a national story, for example, that we've made that case. But I'm curious how you've sort of made that case to others. You know, I think I know how to do it, but I'm interested to know how you do that.
Yeah, I think that Baltimore, and I'm not just saying that because I've taught in Baltimore now for over 20 years. It's really fascinating. And it's really, I mean, it's a cliche to call Maryland the middle ground, but that is what it is. And so Baltimore itself is such an interesting place because it is a city. It's a city that has slavery, that slavery is deeply embedded and enmeshed in, and yet it has this large free population, which means that everything is a little bit different. It's not a city like, say, Richmond, or even a city with a large free Black population like New Orleans. It really is this liminal place where it's very close to freedom. You can use Baltimore if you're African American, use Baltimore as a stepping stone to freedom. And yet it is a place also that slavery is everywhere. And one of the factors that we talk about in Slave Streets, Free Streets is, for example, Baltimore doesn't have a centralized slave market. And as a result, the buying and selling of people literally happens all over the city. It happens in taverns, it happens, you know, in just individual warehouses. It's constantly going on. It's inextricable. So I think if you can understand Baltimore, I think you understand a lot of the conflicts within the nation in the early part of the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, and into the Civil War.
So I think that the other way that folks often come to the history of Baltimore is really through a story that begins in the early 20th century. I wanted to ask you about how you think this part of the story, with part of what was fascinating to me, right, it was the way in which you're able to show us where people live and where people live in relationship to one another. I think that oftentimes we begin a story of Baltimore with the early 20th century, with the advent of formal housing segregation. In our lab at Hard Histories, we've worked on the 1860s and the advent of what was referred to then as separation, right before segregation. But this was really an eye-opener to me about sort of what the city looked like, and it changes the arc, I think, doesn't it, when we think about the housing patterns in Baltimore?
Yeah, I think one of the early things we tried to do with the map actually is take those famous, the HOLC, those redlining maps, and we tried to layer the redlining map of Baltimore on top of our map. The problem is just that 1815 Baltimore is so small that it doesn't work, right? The red line neighborhoods are all just farms at this point. But I think that's right, that Baltimore we think of as this incredibly deeply segregated city. There's the black butterfly image. You know, it's one of the early places with racial covenants. But of course, the Baltimore of 1815, like every Southern city at the time, does not have formal segregation, in part because it's not seen as necessary, because in the view of the white elite, Black is coded as slave. Status is coded by race, and so you don't need to kind of keep people apart. So what we found is that by really just looking at the census data and mapping the census data into onto the ward map of Baltimore for 1820, is the numbers are very close. There's not sort of certain wards that have large free Black populations and certain wards that don't. There's some differences. Obviously, there's some range, but it's much more interspersed. And to me, that makes sense because you also have to factor in that there's really no system of public transportation. So people live walking distance to their work. What we did start to find though, and I talk about this in the article a little bit, is when you dig deep into a place like Fells Point, for example, you do start to realize that free Blacks tend to live in the alleys and wealthy whites tend to live on the main streets. So there is an element, obviously, of housing differentiation. It's just not formal by law segregation.
So I've got questions coming in, and the first is from Sarah Pearsall. Sarah, I'm going to invite you. I think I've invited you to unmute, and you can pose your question. Welcome. Thanks for coming out.
Hi. Thank you so much. Thanks for organizing this, and thanks, Professor Rubin, for coming and telling us about this wonderful project. I have, I guess. Well, my first question is really, I mean, I appreciate that obviously many people want to look at the modern 20th century city, but I'm actually interested in the prehistory of what you're talking about, and partly wondering about the sort of 17th and 18th century development of Baltimore, and in particular, what is obviously the striking preponderance of free Blacks amongst enslaved in this landscape. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little. I was also wondering about whether you're doing any work on gender distinctions or like single woman headed households, widow households, other households, as they might appear in the census, and if that sort of comes through in the mapping you're doing. Anyway, thank you.
Those are great questions. So why are there so many free Blacks in Baltimore at this time? Because there is an increasing number of free Blacks in Maryland at this time. And that's because even though we really associate Maryland, we think, oh, Maryland, tobacco. By the end of the Revolutionary War, Maryland farmers are moving away from tobacco, and particularly in this part of central Maryland. They've moved away from tobacco. They're starting to produce cereal grains. One of the facts I love to share with my students is that Baltimore in this period actually was the nation's leading flour exporter until New York took the title after the opening of the Erie Canal. So as a consequence of this agricultural shift, cereal crops are less labor intensive. And so Maryland slave owners found themselves with a quote unquote surplus. They have more workers, more enslaved people than they can put to work, in their opinion. And so what they do is a combination of things. Some of them are emancipated, and some of this also has to do with laws in Maryland that are, I don't want to say more generous towards emancipation, but more, there are more routes. If you had, for example, a free ancestor, you could sue for emancipation. I'm thinking about Will Thomas's really excellent book about that. What they also do, however, so that's how you wind up with a larger free Black population in general, and they tend to gravitate towards the city because they can get a lot of different jobs there. They can work in shipbuilding, for example. There's brick making. There's all kinds, carpentry, all kinds of industries in the city. At the same time, what Baltimore also becomes, and you really see this transition right around this 1820, is Maryland is a slave exporting state. And so what you can see happening after the War of 1812 is slave sales in Baltimore, most of them before the war are small scale and they're local. It's somebody in Baltimore selling somebody to someone also in Baltimore or out in the county, but it's localized. What you start to see actually in the newspapers after the War of 1812 are advertisements by professional slave traders, people like Austin Woolfolk, for example, saying, wanted to buy 20, 30, 50 Negroes. And those people are being sold out of Maryland entirely, often first to Georgia and South Carolina, and then to Louisiana, and feeding in that way. So that's one answer. The second piece is, yes, there's a lot of really interesting gender differences, and you can see it. You can see it through the census, where you also see it. One of the sources we drew on a lot were the city directories, because starting in 1819, the city directories also listed free Blacks. And so we took advantage of the fact that some of these had been transcribed, and were able to build databases. And so what you do see is a lot of free Black women who are heading their own households. Most of these free Black women who head their households are working as laundresses, and a lot of them also are working in some kind of food. Maybe they run an oyster house, maybe they have a stall at one of the markets. Some of them may have husbands who are enslaved, some of them may have been widowed, some of them may have husbands who are sailors. So their actual marital status is unclear, but there are a number, and I have no idea what that number is, but a significant number of African-American female-headed households in this period, and African-American women who own property, actually, who own their homes in this period.
Terrific. Well, I'll plug two of our speakers from last semester. Will Thomas, who you can find our conversation with Thomas about his recent work about slavery and manumission and freedom suits in Maryland and the Eastern Shore, and also on the work of Dr. Jenny Williams on the internal domestic slave trade out of Baltimore, another guest from last semester. So that's great. Emily Anderson is up next, and Emily, I'm going to invite you to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Sorry, my connection is not great, so I'm going to leave the video off. First off, thank you so much. It's really so fantastic to hear about your research and to see it. It's visually so stimulating as well. A second ago, you actually just touched upon something I was interested in hearing more about, which is sort of how the streets and the sidewalks themselves are sort of significant spaces, and how that's coming out and what you're doing. I feel like this is a topic that's been sort of gotten at through different angles in other areas of research and on other people's research. But it seems like what you're doing really could shed light on, whom people would be seeing and what they're looking at as they're moving between spaces, but also something that I think is really interesting in Baltimore is sort of, which places could you get between, and how that is connected to not only interaction, but something you brought up in your paper, which is sort of the possibilities for advancement. And you just mentioned very quickly sort of the streetcars. I don't know if in the 1880s, if you see a big change in any of these respects.
There are streetcars this early, or even omnibuses this early. I think everything is, maybe a cart, or a horse, if you had one. That's a great question about the street space. And that's been something we really have struggled with how to navigate, which is, how do you represent people from the past in a way that is respectful, right? We don't know what people look like. And we wanted to be careful about how to represent people, in that we didn't want to just dress a lot of people, modern people, up in period clothing and use them. So that's why some of what we're doing is using the dots. A sort of side area of research that was happening in the IRC as we were working on this is the IRC does a lot of virtual reality. And one of the issues they've been doing research on is sort of how real to make an avatar. And that there's a kind of diminishing returns, that actually people seem to respond better to an avatar that's clearly not photorealistic, because then their mind just sort of says, okay, yeah, this isn't quite real, but I'll fill in the gaps in my head. Whereas if it's something that's super close to photorealistic, there's that uncanny valley effect where it becomes distracting. And so we didn't want to do that. So right now on our visualizations, we're using the little dots. We've talked a lot about using silhouettes or kind of shadowy images, again, a kind of stylized representation of a form. But what's also really interesting, and I'm not sure this is what you asked, but I'm going to pivot and talk about it, which is we don't know exactly how to put people on the physical landscape, because oftentimes the kinds of addresses that we have, whether it's from tax records or from city directories, are of limited use, because they'll say something like north of Alisana Street. Like, okay, how far, how north, or between two streets? Well, how far between two streets? Sometimes we have house numbers, but house numbers are even actually less useful because it's often unclear where the numbers started. And Baltimore doesn't start standardizing house numbers until the 1840s. And in fact, no city in the country has standardized house numbers before. I think New York starts it in the 1820s, which is why if you look at early addresses, there's a lot of like 7.5 street, you know, such and such a street. So what we've decided to do, in fact, is when we know someone lived on a street, but we don't know where they lived on a street, we want to physically put them, represent them on the actual street. Because that we know, right? We know if you lived on Strawberry Alley, even if we don't know which house is yours, we know you walked up and down the street because that's how you got around. And so it's this idea of trying to think about your home and your physical space is not just bounded by your house, but more in a sense of neighborhood, and who would then be interacting and how much life was going on these physical streets. Does that kind of answer your question?
I'm fascinated by the puzzle of how to represent people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, anybody or many of us who study the history of slavery and enslaved people's lives wrestle with the very deliberately modest record.
Mm-hmm.
And that is often manifest, or becomes manifest for us in sort of how we write. But it hadn't really occurred to me that there is a companion question about then how to represent people. I just finished an article yesterday and about a woman who I had no description of. But was she tall or short? Was she round or thin? Was she dark or light? You know, did she walk with confidence? Did she, you know, I think it's something you can't avoid almost, I think, in this work.
It's hugely challenging. And I also feel, I'm sure you've experienced this too, right? Where you're reading something about, I don't know, enslaved people in the 1840s, but the illustration that they use is one of those, is like the contrabands from Port Royal from 1860, and you know the image, and just, it drives me crazy. It's been a sort of perennial issue. It's one of the things actually that is interesting about working with non-historians, which is people in the visual arts are much more comfortable with just kind of a general, you know, they'll pull an image of Pastiche. I remember back when I was in grad school working on a project, a digital project about the Shenandoah Valley, and one of our artists pulled a picture of a cotton field, and we said, you can't use cotton because there's no cotton there. And so it's really tricky. And then even if you have a physical description, because one of our best sources for physical descriptions are runaway advertisements or advertisements for freedom seekers, those advertisements themselves, their descriptions are so loaded and complicated, right? What does it mean? You know, the many shades of complexion has a downcast expression. How do you represent, what does that mean? Really, all the time does this person have a resting what we call today resting bitch phase? Probably not. So it's so hard. And that's why more and more, I feel like doing something more stylized, where it's obvious that it's not a quote unquote true representation. And I think too, with a project like ours, where the strength of the map, the strength of it is, it's sort of Achilles heel, which is it's so beautiful that it draws you in. But at the same time, of course, it didn't really look like that. It gives you the illusion that you're back in time, but you're not really. I mean, first of all, it's not dirty. It's not smelly. It's not, it's so hard to try to recapture that texture of the past.
Thank you for that. We had a question from Ken Hawkins. Ken, I'm going to invite you to unmute and ask your question if you're there.
Hi there. This is an excellent project, and I've gone back to it a number of times, and thanks for putting out the materials. I just wanted to ask a general question in terms of where was the project, or what's its status now? Are you still adding data? Are you still doing research? Is it going to stay as a GIS hosted site, or will you spin out articles and or books on it?
So that's a great question. The map itself, the image itself is getting redone, and we're hoping, I've not actually checked in with Dan Bailey recently, but the hope has been to have that redone image finished by probably the end of the year or the beginning of the spring. But that again is just the big base map. In terms of publications coming out of it, we reached a kind of stopping point when we tried for the third time to get major grant funding and didn't get it, kind of for two reasons. One is that Dan is planning on retiring soon. He's been a professor of visual arts and he would like to retire. And the other is, of course, this has always been kind of a side project for me. I mean, I'm actually a Civil War historian. And so I think we're not going to do any more real publications from it. What I do foresee using this for still is I would love to teach. Our senior history majors have to take a capstone class where they write a thesis, and those classes are themed. I would love to do a capstone class where my students write about early Baltimore and draw on the project and draw on, we've got a deep well of databases and research that they can draw on. So something like that might result in putting things up on a website again. Eventually, someday, I have a really weird fascination with Baltimore's 1819 yellow fever epidemic because it has incredible records. There's case records that list people by name and by street. And so you can track the progress of the epidemic. So I would like to maybe do an article about that. So we're in a little bit of a lull, but of course, everything that's online will stay online. And the other piece is once we sort of call it and say, okay, we're done updating it. We've talked a lot with the people at Digital Maryland, which is an offshoot of the Digital Public Libraries of America, and at the Pratt Library about giving them our GIS research and giving them our databases and base material, and so that all of our research material will be made publicly available.
You're raising fascinating questions about the life of a digital project that I think are so important and a lot of us are thinking about. But I'm going to pass the mic to Lauren Feldman, who I think has a question for you.
Sure. And if anyone in our virtual audience can't hear me, please let me know. And or Martha might recap my question at the end if it's not adequately audible. But thank you, Dr. Rubin. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing this project with us. It is so rich in so many ways. I think the questions are reflecting that. And I think my question dovetails pretty nicely off of what was just said about the life of this project and where it goes in its next phases. And I'm interested in hearing you talk about the question of what scholarly conversation do you most seek to influence with this project? Like, in a sense, like there's so much here that ways that you can answer this question, and the answer very well could be all of them, why choose? And that's, I'd be, thrilled to hear that as well. But in a sense, is the historiography that you want to engage with, primarily, is it, you can think of it in any ways, early Republic historiography, Baltimore historiography, is it demographic in nature? Is it a project of archival recovery that, in a sense, just the figures stand on their own and we don't need to kind of think too much about a historiographical conversation? Is it digital history? I mean, in a sense, like, of course you published this in a digital history journal, you said it was peer reviewed, which, means that, there's a certain process that this went through. So I'd be really interested to hear sort of, in a sense of, what and which historians are you most interested in engaging with on this, or is it any and all of the above?
It's a great question, and it's a tricky question for me as a historian, because it gets at the part of this that I've always been a little uncomfortable with, which is I don't know that we're making a historiographical argument or a historiographical contribution, because I feel like the argument that I'm making, which is you can actually recover the lives of ordinary people in Baltimore, and that Baltimore was this place with a mixed labor market. All of those arguments are really out there already through Seth's work, through Martha's work, through Chris Phillips' work, Steve Whitman. I mean, there's a rich historiography and a rich literature that we've drawn on. And so that I've always seen this less as a project where I'm doing my own original research and making my own original argument, although maybe when I get to my little yellow fever thing, and more as a project, I guess, in a sense, in expanding digital boundaries, and particularly in taking these arguments, which we as historians know well and understand, and bringing them to a wider population. Our big base map sits in, there is one at the Maryland Center. We've talked, and then the pandemic happened, but we had been talking about doing an event with the Lewis Museum, the Reginald Lewis Museum of African American History and Culture, which is such a natural home for this also. And really, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, this is a project that's most useful for education, K to 12. My favorite tours, when we have a big standalone kiosk of this in the Imaging Research Center, we give tons of tours, as Martha alluded to. And I used to love giving tours. We would have school groups come in. And I loved giving kids tours, because these are often kids from Baltimore City, often African-American, who have not seen their lives represented. Or if they have seen their lives represented, it's often in pathologized ways, like on The Wire or something like that. And so to show them, look, here's Baltimore 200 years ago. There were people like you. I always start with kids. I start them at Lexington Market, because that is a place they all know, and to show them, look, it's in exactly the same place. So that's where I think its greatest value comes, is less a contribution to the scholarly conversation and more a contribution to the more general conversation.
I mean, I appreciate that, though I think it's a little modest, if I can say.
Thank you.
It's because
I agree.
yeah. Well, why don't you say what you?
No. You're in the middle of the thought. Yeah.
Well, just to say that in working on Baltimore, it took me a long time to attend to where people and institutions were in relation to one another, right? That you move through oftentimes serially, and it was only by deliberate engagement with space that I could begin to recognize that this church was proximate to that church, was proximate to that church, right? And that folks were actually on a Sunday were encountering one another in a very finite kind of geography of the city, in ways that I hadn't understood, I don't think, from even from the city directory. I had to really think spatially. And so I think there's a way in which it's a challenge to a lot of us who don't think deliberately and analytically about the role that space and distance and modes of transportation, all of the ways in which all of those play critical factors in the histories we write, and only sometimes do we attend to them or inconsistently attend to them. And the cityscape is such an amazing opportunity to think in that way. But it takes me to a question I wanted to ask you, which was, how do you see the relative benefits of this sort of mapping, really from whole cloth, as contrasted with, say, creating, using a period map and sort of animating that, or, you know, David Rumsey's work, right, where Rumsey is sort of doing this layering, right, of the 21st century onto, you know, earlier maps. I wonder what you think about the relative value of building this from whole cloth. Because I'm somebody who only ever thought about space by looking at an 1856 map of Baltimore that sat on my wall for a very long time. And this is a very different, this leads to very different thinking.
Yeah, yes. And it's interesting that the person, you know, who really led this effort is Dan Bailey, who comes from visual arts. And in fact, is an animator initially, I think, by training. So that for Dan, the puzzle that he wanted to solve, and he had done an earlier project with Washington, D.C. using Benjamin Latrobe's maps that was called, I think it was called Visualizing Early Washington. For him, what interested him was, how do you visualize a city before photography? And how do you sort of put all of those pieces in place? And so that was his challenge, was to rebuild the city before you had photographs of it. I mean, I'll be honest, you know, this kind of work is so laborious, it's so time consuming, it's so expensive that it's not practical, and that especially as programs like even ArcGIS and all these different mapping programs have become so much more user friendly that you know, Story Map and things like that, where you can take existing period maps and layer them together and manipulate them and you know, geo-rectify them, right? Get them to line up. I mean, I do think that's in a lot of ways, that's the smarter play, right? Because you can do that with, you know, you or a couple of grad students. It's much less expensive, and I'm a big proponent of what I call like the cheap digital humanities, or like small ball digital humanities, where you kind of pull together, you know, a $10,000 grant here and a $10,000 grant here, and maybe you get the big $250,000 NEH grant, but there's so few of them. The advantage, I guess, from starting from the ground up is when you start with the real base topography, you're starting with actually more information than people had at the time. And so you're able to do, I think, a better recreation, because a lot of these maps, period maps, are not quote unquote correct, right? A lot of them are like planning maps, so they're speculative. They'll put stuff in the wrong place, they'll stretch. But I also, you can see I'm working these issues out in my head as I'm talking. I also think, though, that so when I did my Sherman project, what I did was I online, there's a sort of stylized map, and you can track Sherman's march through Georgia, and you can click on little points and see the story of places and see those places from different perspectives. And we have layers of different maps representing different genres. Back in 2008, when I started working on that project, I had research support. I was on leave, and I was going to go to Georgia and retrace Sherman's march across Georgia. And this was, of course, before you had GPS on your phone, which is always sort of staggering to people. But I thought, oh, should I take some of my research money and buy a GPS like thingy? I don't even know what you called it. where I could go and I could be like tracking the latitude and longitude as I stopped places. And then I thought about it and I thought, Sherman didn't carry a GPS. And it was the most liberating thought I could possibly have had, because I realized, of course, Sherman didn't have GPS. And that allowed me to forget about precision, to accept that precision is an illusion. And that it sort of reshaped, I think, the way I thought about the whole book, which was, it didn't matter to me whether the different stories people told were quote unquote true or quote unquote false. That what mattered to me was the stories that they tell. And so I think this is a very long answer, but I think in terms of what matters more are the basic spatial relations, at least for me, the basic spatial relations, right? This church was next to this church. They lived in the same neighborhood. They probably interacted, rather than getting the house number right, I guess.
I mean, I guess the other thing that you lead me to think is that there's a difference, isn't there? And maybe there's a chasm between our sense of a 21st century capacity to recreate, right, the geography and the topography, the architecture and more, and the ways in which folks saw that terrain in the 19th century, which is to say, what I judge to be near or far,
Right.
is oftentimes like rooted in deep assumptions about distance and how it works. And I love how you kept coming back to saying most people are moving around this city in this period on foot, which for a lot of us is a challenging way to think about how to actually live and day in, day out in a cityscape. And so the deep assumptions are there.
And I think too, as a 19th century historian, I'm very comfortable with imprecision. And I'm very comfortable with not knowing all the answers. And that's one of the things I often try to convey to my students also is there's just going to be huge holes when you study the past and the ways that, people in the 19th century didn't have standardized birth certificates. They didn't carry ID. The ways that people could become other people if they so chose, that it was much easier. And that there's just, the not knowing to me is actually not a problem.
That's fascinating, because as you can imagine, in our work in the lab, there are great sort of spaces of not knowing. And I think it's okay to quote our provost, Sunil Kumar, who said to me, until he had worked with us, he hadn't understood that historians don't just call up the evidence, that they need, and then, do the analysis to get an answer, but that we're first navigating this very, sort of incomplete sort of record, which distinguishes us from a lot of social science colleagues for whom the creation of data sets through all kinds of means gives them a different sort of command over evidence. And so it's a really important point. And it takes me, if I could, just one last question. What's next? I mean, is this digital work a regular part of sort of who you are and how you think about projects now? Because you mentioned this as a side project, and we only have a couple minutes, so I want to hear about what you're working on next. But I wonder, do you feel the imperative now to always bring a digital humanist
I wouldn't
perspective?
say that I feel an imperative, but I would say that I think working on digital projects side by side with traditional written projects, I think the fact that I'm trained as a historian and I write and I think like a historian improves my digital work, but I think being forced to think about audience in different ways and to think about visualization in different ways, and how does something visual drive your narrative in a way that you don't have to use as many words, also has made me a better writer and a better historian. And I also think I have no illusions about the size of the audience for the kinds of books that I write. I'm not selling scads of copies of books, right? I get those royalty checks every year, and they are not large. And so I do feel that the digital opens up different audiences. So I'm doing this project looking at hunger and famines in the Civil War era South. So, and it's a project that has really evolved as it's gone on. But what I'm trying to do is say, okay, we know that the South runs out of food. We know that there's lots of, at least pockets of hunger in the South. What does that look like? What are people really eating? So some of it is looking at food shortages and food substitution. Some of it is looking at the perspectives of poor white farmers and how are these women managing when their husbands are off in the army? Are they getting relief from local planters and things like that? A big piece of it is looking at refugees, African-American refugees who run away from plantations and run to the Union lines, where then the Union Union Army is forced to become a kind of social welfare agency, and they don't, frankly, do it very well. And the kinds of assumptions that they make about who is quote unquote worthy of relief, who should be fed, what are the conditions for being fed, those kinds of questions. And then the piece that I think is really going to be the digital piece is then after the Civil War ends, there's a famine, crop failures in a lot of the South in 1867. And there's all these different Northern relief organizations, and again, using that are elite Northerners are sending money and sending supplies to the South. So what I want to try to do is network analysis of seeing, okay, who is getting relief from the one that I'm particularly have used the records of is now I'm going to get it wrong. It's the New York Ladies Southern Relief Association, and they have the Virginia Center for History and Culture has their papers, and there's hundreds and hundreds of letters, not only detailing who they're sending it to, which is often ministers, but then often detailing the distribution, right? Mrs. So-and-so got 10 bushels of corn. So I want to do a kind of network analysis and mapping of that. And I also want to see where the Freedmen's Bureau is operating and giving supplies to African Americans. So that's going to be the digital piece for it, but it is a little bit off in the future. This is a bigger project, I think, than I thought it would be. And I'm definitely at the stage in a project where I feel like I can't quite, I've done a lot of research and I still feel like it's kind of a mess. I know it'll get there. It's just, you got to go, right? The only way out is through. So.
That is a very good note to end on. I think a lot of people can relate to this. Our hour is going quickly, but we want to thank you so much. And folks are sending appreciation.
This was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
And waving hello and otherwise in the chat. For those of you who didn't get your questions in, I'll let you know that Dr. Rubin is on Twitter at hashtag Anne Sarah Rubin, or no.
Yep, that's
Yep, is that it? And you can find her at UMBC. And we look forward to having you back when you're ready to talk about this next project. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
I want to mention to folks, we have upcoming 3 more workshop sessions this semester. Dr. Tammy Fletcher, Dr. Ana Rosado, and Dr. Matthew Craven. And so please stay tuned. You can register at the SNF Agora page, and we look forward to welcoming you back. So thank you again, Dr. Rubin. Thank you, Lauren, and everybody at SNF Agora for the support. And we look forward to seeing you all the next time. Thank you.